What actually causes divorce?
We're just not connecting the way that we used to, or talking the way that we used to. We're not talking about sex anymore. We're talking about, well, when you get home from work, what do you do? Do you ask each other how your day? No, we don't really talk to each other at all. Then it's like, well, I know why you're not having sex.
You can be angry and you can be horny. You want sex and you can be angry, and that's it. Those are the two emotions that men are allowed to have.
When people want to work on divorce recovery, where are they at step one?
Sex is the easiest hot button thing to bring into the space. It's really difficult for men to say, like, I've failed in something that I've done in my life.
It is really valuable insight about a relationship. It says a lot. It does capture in sort of this perfect way all of what is or isn't happening between two people, and in this physical expression of it, and whether it's not happening at all, or the nature of it, or people enjoying it, are they connected to each other?
Have you ever wondered what masculinity even is in the modern era? Are you ready to move beyond the macho bully or the soy boy archetypes? I'm Marc Azoulay, and this is the Men's Therapy Podcast. Together, we'll explore how neuroscience, Jungian psychology, and Buddhist philosophy can transform your life, your marriage, and your business. Are you ready to deep dive into the minds of men? Let's begin.
Hello and welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Marc Azoulay, and we're here talking about divorce. So this was the number one topic requested by our listeners. We recently did a survey through our newsletter and through our podcast subscribers, and by and large, like by a mile, divorce recovery was a topic that you all are most interested in. If you want to get involved in that survey, you can go to our website, menstherapy.online, sign up for the newsletter at the bottom, and I'll send you that survey as one of the first emails you get from us. So probably about 2 or 3 times a year, we're going to be doing episodes like this, where we're focused on what you want to hear us talk about. So we have 2 wonderful guests, returning voices. They've been featured on our website multiple times. I'm really excited to reintroduce you to them. So guys, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves to the audience, say a little bit about who you are and your work with men? Jack, you want to start us off?
Sure. Good to be here. My name is Jack Lambert. I'm a therapist working in New York City. My practice is specifically focused on gay and queer men. In my experience with divorce, along with working with children of divorce and being a child of divorce myself, I work with a lot of guys who are coming out later in life or transitioning to new forms of relationships. I'm excited to be here and talk more about that.
And Ben, how about you?
My name is Ben White. I work, my practice is based physically in Lafayette, Colorado. I work around the state of Colorado virtually in Massachusetts, Utah, Vermont, Washington, and Montana. And I think there's some people, like a lot of people looking through therapist listings, and they just see a guy with a beard, and they just, whatever reason, they're just like, that seems more comfortable than, the 99 other women that I just scrolled through. Nothing against them, but like, it is a fact. Every therapist circle that I've been a part of, it's like, I think like 9 women for every male therapist. And so men have just as much of a need for therapy as women do. And then as far as divorce goes, it's interesting that it seems like it takes something that kind of life shattering to get guys into therapy sometimes. And I feel like that's how I encounter it is that something really, it's interesting to me that that's the most popular requested topic too, that, that a lot of men that were in the therapy, seeking therapy and, is affiliated with men's therapy online has something to do with divorce is relevant for their lives, because that seems to be a popular way that people find their way to me too. Like something bad happened and now they need to pick up the pieces. So here we are.
Yeah, how about we start with that question? Because I think you're spot on, and I see that with a lot of the guys I work with, is divorce is that rock bottom. It's often when the patterns that may have been more subtle become undeniable in a way, and there's some real consequences, right? Loss of partnership, loss of family, sometimes even loss of job or development of an addiction, right? You start drinking too much. So I'm curious for the two of you, when you work with people, what does that rock bottom look like? When people come to you and they want to work on divorce recovery, where are they at step one? Or maybe ground zero might be a better place to talk about it.
I think a lot of the times when we see them, it's almost, I don't want to say too late. That's such a bleak thing to say, but I guess I'll just speak to my experience of a lot of the time when people are talking about this, it is, how do I work through transitioning out of this relationship? It is rarely about, I want to save this relationship. Sometimes it turns into that because we talk about ways in which we can structure a relationship so it doesn't just feel like it's this, either or situation. But it is kind of a chicken or egg situation, like you're talking about. Like, if someone's actively in the throes of addiction and trying to make a relationship work, rarely are they going to make the relationship work before treating, addictive behavior. Or if someone's going through a newly formed diagnosis of some sort, usually it's about maintaining that before the relationship can really be repaired if there has been a rupture. So it's unfortunate, I think, to think of divorce as being the rock bottom, because sometimes it is just something that happens. People go through divorce, but when it's felt so heavily that way, I think it's really difficult for men to come to therapy. And in, I think, their eyes, which I'm going to say this, and I think we should certainly talk about it, but like, in their eyes, coming to say like, I've failed in something that I've done in my life.
Yeah, which is really hard for like a Western acculturated man to say, right? Like I've failed. And the failure is in some ways undeniable. It's a very public, often failure for guys.
Yeah, it's just, I was thinking back to all the men in relationships that I've worked with, whether they've ended or not yet, or where they've been, like how it has it been inevitable, as you said, Jack. And I think that sometimes that's true, but always the wheels are in motion. I feel like by the time somebody comes in and says, "All right, something's wrong, I need therapy," it's either like, a couple months away or a couple weeks away, or maybe it's, maybe they've caught it early. But I definitely feel like there's some correlation between people's relationship being at risk, that serious risk in some way, and what drives them to come see me. And then what happens from there, it's interesting. And I don't know if I've ever put words to this, so I appreciate the question, Mark, that it almost seems like sometimes people come to therapy because they know the relationship's about to tank. They know the relationship's about to fail, and it's not as much, maybe in their mind, it's maybe this will save it. Maybe I'll be able to work on myself, and this will help me, keep the relationship together. But also, in some way, I wonder if they're just wisely setting themselves up to have some support throughout what's going to be a really, really difficult time for themselves. That's happened a few times. I don't know if I've ever thought about that.
That's a really interesting point. I think there's probably something to that, right? Because as therapists, we're not miracle workers, right? So we're not going to be able to save it, especially in a short-term session. So if you start seeing them and the divorce is 2 or 3 months later, there's really nothing that you could have done, So I could see it being a way to find a lifeline, knowing that the storm is coming.
And I think even for us, it's sometimes one of the hardest things to work with, of someone really wanting you to fix something for them, and really almost outrightly asking for it, of just, what do I do to make this work? I think that the other side benefit of what you're talking about, of someone who's like, preemptively, I know this is going to be hard. So I want to try to give myself all the support that I can. I think that's one of the best things that you can do, because then you're approaching it not from the acknowledgement of, I need this person to fix something in my life, but of, this is going to be something I will want support with.
When you were all talking, I was thinking about what my answer would be. And I think for a lot of guys, divorce, it's like an emotional challenge and a relational challenge. And I think by and large, I think we're acculturated to not be very good at those, or not have a lot of tools for those. I think divorce is one of those things where, despite what the manosphere says, like being jacked and being rich isn't going to fix it for you. You can't overcome it with like physical or financial means. If the emotion in your relationship is dead and atrophying, you need to learn different skills, right? You need to learn how to attune, how to validate, how to resolve conflict, how to handle and hold difficult feelings, how to go through grief. We can keep going, but there's an emotional toolkit that I think if you don't have, your relationships are in some ways bound to fail, because you reach some level of called difficulty or challenge or even complexity when you're just around someone for a long enough amount of time, right? Kind of all these different ugly parts of our personality are going to come out because we just spent a lot of time with them. I'm curious, from the two of you, maybe riffing off of that, what actually causes divorce? What are some of the things that you see that leads to this inevitable moment?
Well, I'm going to jump in and say, sex is the biggest thing that I hear about. It's number one on sex. Is what sex? Let's talk about sex. I'm not getting enough sex. And then, once we get that out of the way, then we can really talk about what else is there. But it's the easiest hot button thing to bring into the space.
Well, and it's the window into it too. I mean, sex, I mean, unless I don't know what maybe everyone has different conceptions of or relationships to sex, but the way I think about it is that it does capture in sort of this perfect way all of what is or isn't happening between two people, and in this physical expression of it, and whether it's not happening at all, or the nature of it, or are people enjoying it, are they connected to each other? I mean, it just has. It's not a. I mean, I kind of like, I'm a little bit sort of tongue in cheek and being like, oh, here we go. Is this, the sex, I'm not getting enough sex conversation again. But also it is really valuable insight about a relationship.
Totally. Yeah, I think the sexual dynamic is critical. I mean, as therapists, we focus on the unconscious in many ways, right? And the nonverbal and the unspoken. And I found in so many of the people and couples I work with, like if they can be truly honest about their sexual dynamic, you can learn a lot about their relationship, right? You can learn a lot about how the power flows. You can learn a lot about how they ask and receive things. You can learn a lot about how comfortable they are, how creative they are. There's a lot going on in that sexual dynamic. So what are some things that are underneath that sex piece, right? Because yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think it is an important part of a relationship, and I think especially in our culture, it's this idea that you should be having sex constantly, and if you're not having sex, you're in an unhealthy relationship, right? It's a very black and white thing, which I don't believe is entirely true, right? I think there are seasons of sexuality, and sometimes in a relationship, you're just like not feeling it, right? Or there's other priorities that that come up, but if we see it as more of a symptom, which I hear both you all talking about, what are some of the deeper causes underneath the symptom of a lack of sex in a relationship?
Yeah, that's a good point to be said for, anyone who's in a relationship and not having sex 5 times a week, and like, "I'm pretty happy. I'm pretty content in my relationship." Like, that is not a, signal for divorce as much as it is the entryway point for a lot of people, I think, to talk about why they're unhappy with, not feeling that their needs are being met, or feeling a values shift between them and their partner, or feeling like they just are not communicating in the way that they used to. I think is another a thing that I hear. We're just not connecting the way that we used to. We're talking the way that we used to. And a lot of the times we're not talking then about sex anymore. We're talking about, well, when you get home from work, what do you do? Do you go on dates? Do you ask each other how your day? No, we don't really talk to each other at all. Then it's like, well, I know why you're not having sex because there's no communication going on here. So to take something as literal as we're not having enough sex and then getting down to, well, we just don't speak to each other really, then there's a lot more to be said for that than there is really the sexual relationship.
Like maybe I have like a romanticized version of sex, but like in my mind, I could, sort of replace it with like, it's like an expression of emotional connection. Like you feel really emotionally connected to somebody, and you're attracted to them, you want to have sex. And when there is no emotional connection, whether because, you're just super busy and you're exhausted at the end of your days and you're not talking to each other at all, or you've got 17 kids and who the hell has time for that, or, three or two or one kid, and who the hell has time for emotional connection. I think that's sort of what's behind it, and it's interesting to think about. I think I hear sex a lot too as sort of like, this is why it's not working, quote unquote, and it's interesting that in my mind, I think men and women both, but men especially, given our sort of a complicated, sociological, relationship to our own emotional lives, we kind of tend to use sex as a means for emotional connection. Like it's kind of one of the only ways that it's okay for men to have emotional connection is to get laid. But women typically have lots of other outlets for that. And I'm being a little bit gendered in my stereotypes about how these things work, but in general, you know. If you have anybody who has very few outlets for emotional connection with their partner, probably is going to over rely on or see sex as sort of a litmus test for how they're doing, and there's got to be more. There's got to be more going on, I think.
Yeah. I think that's a really key point there, where I think a guy that has not explored and developed emotional skills or emotional needs, which again, we're not given that out of the box in many ways, right? We're taught the opposite. It's like when I talk with guys, it's like, okay, we're not having enough sex and we're fighting too much. right? So it's like, all I want is I want to get laid and I want peace. And that's like
Those
kind
are
of
the
your
two emotions that men are allowed to have. You can
right,
be angry and you can be horny. You can have
right.
you want sex and you can be angry and that's it.
That's it. And such a narrow band to your point, Ben, right? Like it's such a narrow band of where, no, typical guy or whatever, the uninitiated guy of like what you can complain about because we don't have other points of connection along the emotional spectrum. So when one of those goes south, then 50% of your relationship sucks, versus if you had more going on, then you'd be buffered by more diversity in the way that you connect.
I want to hear Jack's story.
I was well, in some ways, I think I could relate exactly to that of kind of saying, I had this client who's a bisexual man currently dating and engaged to a woman, and he almost broke off the engagement because he had recently been put on an antidepressant and just his libido was not, what it used to be, and was fully kind of falling into the space of I can't deliver on kind of being this unemotional monolith. Like I'm down a lot of the times, and I feel like she's kind of helping, keep me up, and then I can't even deliver sexually. So what am I even bringing this to this relationship? And almost called off the engagement simply because it's like, well, I as a man am not bringing anything to this relationship, and really kept kind of needing reassurance from her that it was okay. And at some point then he was telling me, well, she's getting annoyed at me for constantly asking. I'm like, well, why do you think? I think you either have to believe her or you have to change in your mind what being a man in a relationship, I heavily quote, means, because clearly she's not running for the hills. So something else, some other things are happening as well. So it just never is that narrow band. And if it is, maybe that's not the relationship for you. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I see a lot of that. My gut, shoot from the hip reaction is like the issue is not the lack of sex, but it might be the self-pitying. It might be like the need to be taken care of or the need to just kind of get a pass or a buy or whatever he's trying to, induce from the partner, right? I think that's less attractive than just not having sex for a while because you're going through depression. I find that, by and large, women are very accepting of all of us as long as we're honest about it. As long as we give them the whole truth, even if it's ugly or something that we're ashamed of, I think they prefer the connection, right? They prefer to know where we're at rather than just like keep that stoic archetype. And that kind of brings me to my next question of this identity loss that I think happens, grief, identity grief, even with a divorce. You have guys that I think lose that identity of provider, Jack, to your story, right? Or lover, or protector. I think for a lot of guys, they those fall away, um, when a divorce happens and is finalized. And I'm curious from each of you if you have, stories from your caseload or even just speaking about what that grief is like for guys when they have to confront the fact that those identities have been challenged and maybe even broken. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us to reach more men and inspire them to become the best versions of themselves. Thank you for your support. And now back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear your stories, Jack, because I know you said you work with a lot of people who, maybe got married under one premise about who they were, and then that changes, that they realize that that's not who they really ever were, and um, it's not quite it's not as common in my practice, but I feel like I see people who, for whatever reason, have defined themselves by, well, when if I can be married or if I have children and have a family and have a good job, like that's really somewhere along the line they decided that like that was what they needed to do to be a person, to be a man, to have an identity. And then if that falls apart and that it's not resting on anything, there's no solid foundation beneath that. When that falls away, when the relationship doesn't work, it's really a crisis. It's really disorienting for people. So, you know, specific stories, I don't know if I could come up with any at the moment, other than, just to say generally. I mean, I think this is sort of me, going to be like a broken record and maybe harken back to our grief conversation that we all had, which is, it is a loss, and it is a major loss, and it's the relationship dying, is, if you can see it, like in this way, it's an opportunity to take a really emotionally difficult situation and make something of it. I mean, or not, and then maybe risk repeating it again, or spend 10 years, sleeping under a bridge somewhere, because that's where it led you. But it really does provide, I think, a really heightened sort of emotional activity when something like this is afoot, and people can maybe come out of it making finally establishing a life and an identity for themselves that's maybe more solid, maybe more authentic to who they are.
I'm glad you brought up the grief aspect of it, because I was even in my mind thinking, what am I going to say that's different from the grief component? Because it's almost a one-to-one comparison, because it is a loss. It is, the death of a relationship. It is, all of these things. And I think if we brought up the word failure, like it's just all those trigger buttons that I think, again, for like the typically masculinized person to say like, well, I need to either be angry about this, or I need to turn all of this inward and say like, I fucked up and I did something wrong, which I think both sides are completely missing the point of this is an opportunity, if nothing else. A lot of people don't let themselves feel relief maybe at the end of a relationship because they feel like that means something bad, or they don't let themselves feel sad about it because that means, oh, if I feel sad, then I shouldn't be letting it fall apart. Like just tying yourself into knots, with these relationships. I from like my case experience of just like the most typical knot of just like a man who was married to a woman and had a kid and, got divorced and realized he was gay and was tying himself into knots about not only am I leaving this relationship considering myself failed as like a straight guy, but now I'm older, entering the gay community, have absolutely no idea what I'm doing, and feel like the only thing available to me is to go to a pride parade or, do these like extreme, the stereotypical things that I heard coming out of this man's mouth. I was like, whoa, like, it's like, why do you feel like that's the only thing available to you? And in a much more broad context, I think it does feel like for someone going through divorce or going through any sort of life shift like that, ending of a relationship and beginning of a new life, it feels like the opportunities really are slim. Like you aren't coming out into anything better, or the possibility of anything better. It is, well, now I've either had to start at the beginning again, or I'm starting hugely below where I was, which is so, we meet these men at such a point of lowness in their life. And not that it's our job to hoist them up and say, look at all of what's available to you, but I don't think they get that reflected a lot to them.
Yeah, what do you guys think the difference maker is? Because that's what I'm hearing is like, and what I see, right, is like you have guys that really, really crumble after a divorce. It's not just the loss of, their partner and maybe even their children, but I see guys, they start drinking way too much, right? Start drugging. Sometimes they act out, they can't control their emotions and they lose their job. They often lose their home. Sometimes they have to move, right? It can be this like real catastrophe. And what's even more painful to witness is the guys that are kind of like, to use, substance use terms like dry drunks, where it's 10 years later, but they're still, ragging on the ex and they're still in this stuck place of anger and hatred, and then there's the guys that, therapy, I think being a catalyst, but they're the guys that like, individuate and become a new person and maybe find a new relationship and maybe pick up an old hobby that they let slack for a long time. It seems like very polarized in my experience. So I'm curious for the two of you, like, what do you think some of those difference makers are, as far as what can help somebody go, choose one path over another?
First comes to my mind is like I feel like it has everything to do with, I mean, so whether someone feels, and this is just sort of like a personal quirky little theory of mine, that like people's feelings about life in general and their hope for the future and their day-to-day well-being has everything to do with how like truly do they believe that like a meaningful relationship is available to them. Like what are the prospects? Can I have meaningful relationships, not just intimate partnerships, but close friendships? Can I forge close friendships and meaningful intimate relationships relationship? Is that available to me? Am I able to tolerate that? And if it didn't work for some reason that doesn't get acknowledged, I mean, I think relationships fail for reasons. They're different reasons. There's some similar, some different, but whether somebody ends up sort of drinking themselves, numb for 10 years, or actually, moving into a life that's more fulfilling for them, to me, I wonder if it has something to do with their ability to actually be really courageous and acknowledge, like, what the fuck happened here? Like, what went wrong? Like, what was that? And not to point the finger and play the blame game and say that people fucked up, but like, how did I participate in that? Like, what did I have to do with, what role did I play? I mean, maybe it was just as simple as, like, I chose somebody who was always going to be unavailable, and therefore I was always miserable. Or maybe I was unavailable, and I need to acknowledge the ways in which I kept a distance from my partner, and that pushed them away. Whatever it was, I think you have to be, if that doesn't get acknowledged and worked on somehow, or it never even gets acknowledged, then there's not a whole lot of hope for what's available. The only thing available is still the same thing that didn't work, and you kind of know that, and it's really depressing. So if you can manage, though, to like see it really clearly and be really courageous, and like see, look at yourself really squarely and look at the relationship, then I feel like that lends itself towards a better outcome, a more fulfilling transition.
And I think, just to jump off that, usually what that entails is letting go of any notion of what it means to be a man in a relationship, because we're talking about divorce here, but it's also, not to come for the sanctity of marriage, but marriage is a structure. It's a relationship. Marriage is the legal part. Like, it's if you can handle relationships, you can handle going through a divorce. If you can't handle losing a job, or having, an ex break up with you, or having your kids say no to you, then you're going to have a much harder time being able to look at yourself. And there's a fine line then between blaming yourself versus, can I just at least look at myself and just see what the interaction was? So I think when people hear, like, look at yourself, they're so quick to say, well, there's part of me that's beating the shit out of myself, and I don't want to look at that part. And then say, like, well, you don't have to beat yourself up, but you could say, when, to your point, Ben, of, well, what happened there? What was the interaction at all?
Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing is what I tell a lot of my guys that ask me, like, okay, what is therapy? The answer I say is it's accountability without shame. I find that as like kind of a masculine way to talk about the therapy process that a lot of guys get. And I'm hearing that from both of you. It's like, yeah, taking accountability, take responsibility. You don't have to feel bad about it, but like, let's try to get better, right? Let's try to iterate on this. Let's try to learn some skills, or heal some trauma, or figure out what holes we had, so that we can make a better life for ourselves, right? And it comes from a place ultimately of love and wanting to nurture yourself and grow and become a better person, right? It doesn't have to come from this, like, whipping yourself into into being a better person. But for guys, I think that's hard. I think we use shame a lot to try to improve ourselves, and the people, the lovers in our lives, they can feel that, right? I think they feel that shame first and foremost. They don't It often overshadows whatever improvement that we may be making. I'm curious, Jack. You talked about a little bit about, some myths of masculinity that kind of need to get broken, or that do get broken through the divorce process and through the divorce recovery and rebuilding process. I'm curious if you can go into that a little bit more. What are some of those kind of man box things, right, that need to get challenged in order to navigate this successfully?
I mean, the list of, men don't cry, men aren't the ones to end the relationship, or, it's the man's job to X, Y, and Z. Like, if you're starting any sentence with, it is the man's job or the man's duty, the wheel's already a little too shaky to move forward, because now we're not, you're no longer a person anymore. You're a man. We're no longer talking about you as an individual. We're talking about you as an archetype. And that's always going to feel difficult to separate yourself from. So if I, as a therapist, were to reflect anything, or to look for accountability without shame, to your point, Mark, they're not going to be able to connect with that because it really depends on how much they actually identify with who they are versus what they represent in the relationship. So I would say, if I were to take one of those and really kind of say maybe the biggest one that should be broken or looked at, I think it really is men are supposed to be unemotional when it comes to relationships with women. Or I honestly, because I'm thinking of some of my guys in relationships with men, and it's like, no, it also applies to them, because I think we're generally socialized, regardless of we're gay, straight, or bi, to have this idea of masculinity as being not only attractive but kind of something sought after. So as soon as we can realize that we can be emotional and it's not emasculating and it's not going to be the reason a relationship erodes, I think it actually allows us to do the interpersonal work or the accountability and hold it in a different way that isn't a threat to us as much as it is, oh, this is good to know. I could use this to my advantage, not in a manipulative way, I think, as some people take that, but as a way to actually feel closer, connected, and more secure. And I, to the idea when you were talking about not being able to look at yourself in a relationship, when we talk about harm, in a relationship that either leads to a divorce or is a catalyst for divorce, it's so much easier to point the finger and say, well, you made me do this. You're the reason I cheated or yelled or did X, Y, and Z, rather than acknowledging maybe there's a part of us that wanted to hurt, or there exists within us the capacity, to hurt other people. And that isn't inherently a bad thing. It's to look at, well, what made that part come out? Why did I feel comfortable, using that part within that dynamic? And that's a heavy, that's not a first session of therapy question to get into, but I do think you can't get to that point unless you allow yourself just straight up to feel.
Yeah. It makes me think of a client who, was coming from divorce, and he would, he'd be telling a story about something that was happening in his family or something in his life. And then he would stop himself and say, like, yeah, but like, I don't care about that. Like, he kept saying, like, I don't care about that. Right. And I think there's
I
this.
love I love the comeback, the constant recorrection, but like, I don't actually care about that. I'm just telling you because that's what I'm supposed to do in therapy,
Right,
right?
I'm just being a good client. I'm doing this for you, right? I'm not doing it for me. Like, I don't care, right? Um, and I think it's to that man box thing, like the strongest man, quote unquote, like doesn't care about anything, right? He's bulletproof, he's Teflon, he nothing touches him. But then if you talk about a relationship, if you don't care about your relationship or you don't care about your partner, it's not gonna work, right? Like, you have to care. You have to be invested, and that means feeling things, right? That means, having reactions. That means being in places of true emotional vulnerability. But I do think so many men, we've been trained just to, like, default to this kind of dismissive, "I don't care, it's not a big deal, it doesn't really matter, I can power through." And while that might seem like strength initially, I think it ultimately creates a lot of distance and a lot of coldness in a relationship, a huge amount of disconnection.
It's interesting, Jack, as you were saying that about, I was thinking back to when I was dating, and I would, inevitably, talk with the women I was, having dinner with or whatever. Like, well, what happened in your last relationship? And I was always listening. The poor gals, didn't even. I mean, I don't know if they knew I was a therapist or not at the point. I started eventually putting that on my dating profile because it seemed to like call to her a little bit. You had to be up for the task. Um, and uh and I would pay attention, very close attention to what they said about their former relationship, and like how emotionally coherent the narrative was, and how much of a part of it they were, or what could they say about it, because I took that as having everything to do with, how prepared they were for another relationship. And this is what I say to the guys that I work with now who are, divorced or separated and dating, and is you have to reckon with it. You have to make some sense out of and have some connection to what actually happened there. And for whatever reason, it's so insidious. I was like doing backflips inside when you said that about, emotionality. I don't know what it is, but it's so ingrained from such an early age. And there's research about how people from, infancy, treat, boys differently and respond to them differently when they cry. And, I think that this goes just layers upon layers of, you get it to be an adult, and the idea of being able to allow yourself to have a range of emotions and to be comfortable with them it's really hard. It's really, really hard, but it's the only thing that makes any relationship work, I think.
And what a good snippet as far as, if you're leaning towards thinking about divorce or feeling, some tumultuous connection within the relationship, to say, well, the way to work on that might not always just be looking at the relationship, but it might be, are there emotions that I have a difficult time tolerating that cause me to lash out, pull back, be cold, all of that? Because then if you can work on yourself in that way, it's not necessary always to say within a relationship, two people need to be working together on one thing. There's a lot of individual work that, of course, is why we don't always do couples therapy. Like that's a version, but you can also work as a couple individually to say, well, I know when they say this, I go straight to that. So if there's a mechanism within there that I can work on, then maybe that issue wouldn't come up as often. Which is, for so many of this, it's hard to put anything in a nice little box and present it as like, this could help your marriage. But I think that more than anything, just emotional flexibility is, certainly a skill that would help with that.
Yeah, I want to hear more about the like sadistic component. Because I think Jack, you were talking about that, and that's something that I focus on in my therapy with my dudes too. Of like that internal aggression, right? The hatred that people carry around, the hurt that they carry around, and their capacity for violence, right? Or an act that is destructive. And when you look at some divorces, right, I think we're talking about, okay, the divorce that kind of atrophies over time, but there's also the divorce that has like, the incident, right, that has like, the affair or the big anger explosion, or God forbid you strike your partner or your child, right, or crash the car, right, or you drank too much and end up in the hospital. There's also kind of like the explosive divorce. So I'm curious from each of you what you can say about that kind of destructive energy that can exist in our relationships, and how one might start to maybe vent that out so it doesn't become catastrophic.
It's unfortunate that literally I'm about to say, like, I've gotten really into Jungian shadow work lately, and so that's what I've been doing with a lot of my clients, but I won't get into that here because that's a whole podcast in and of itself. But essentially this idea of that there are these parts of ourselves that are, you know, wanting to cause destruction or wanting to lie, cheat, steal, whatever they might be, and to protect ourselves, we don't look at them, but they inevitably get through in some way because they're part of us. And I'm always of the mind of, if we see that, a client and I see that kind of take form of naming it and talking about it before it even gets to striking your partner, cheating on your partner, doing something that would have really, disastrous consequences, and identifying what the need is there. And I think a lot of people just would prefer never to talk about that because it sounds like it puts them in a bad light. But again, welcome to therapy. Like, you get to kind of talk about all of these things, and as long as you're not going to hurt yourself or someone else, like, this is where it stays. So I always kind of go with this idea of, I've had many clients who perseverate and just can't let go of this idea of, I'm worried about cheating on my partner. Not because they have any desire to, but just they believe that they have the capacity to do it. And I've watched one client work himself up so much that he did end up cheating on his husband. And we really, had to process just the gut-wrenching feelings around the act, which finally allowed us to talk about, sexually what he's into and what he thought he wasn't allowed to have, and was really trying to recreate a heteronormative relationship and didn't want to even bring up the concept of being open, and all of these things that could have been talked about earlier in the relationship if this, so-called darkness or whatnot could have at least been talked about out in the open.
My mind goes first to like, well, what else? I mean, I don't think people are inherently dark, and by definition, we have darkness as a component of at a place where minds can go in certain circumstances. We've are exposed to certain situations. It's a thing we're capable of, but it makes me wonder like what else is happening too. If you have the inclination to be spiteful or hurtful to a person that you married or that you've spent the last 15 years of your life with, like, well, what happened? Like, what's what's going on that we're also not aware of? And I think in a lot of times it's, anger is, and, or, those aggressive impulses are kind of mixed together with all kinds of other stuff that, back to the, conversation about, the importance of being welcoming of a broad range of emotions. I mean, there's probably a lot of other things that I would be interested in helping someone articulate, because by the time, someone's getting wasted and crashing their car, a mile down the road on their way home from the bar or whatever, there's probably been a whole other set of events and feelings that have either been neglected or just pushed right past. And it's not uncommon, I guess, for anger and aggression, that's more comfortable. That's the place where we end up, because it's more gratifying. It feels better than, like, if I'm going to be honest, like what's behind, wanting to cheat sometimes, looking for, if you're in a monogamous relationship, looking outside of it, not getting something that you feel like you've never gotten, and feeling, neglected by a partner in the way that you might have felt neglected by, in a family of origin. Like, that's not stuff that no one's going to want to wake up and like start to talk about that. It's much more gratifying to be like, fuck that, like, I'm pissed, like, and that's the way it gets sort of channeled, because it's feels better, truthfully. But it's probably really complicated, I think.
I love talking about the fuck it's in therapy. It's one of my favorite things because, you it's ridiculous to assume that every time you come in to talk about yourself, you're really gonna genuinely want to talk about yourself. There's so much to be said for just having a day. Yeah, of just having a day saying like, fuck it, I don't want to do this work. So I think that's such a good point of like, we don't always want to talk about the darkness if it is there, or want to talk about our family of origin, or how hellish, our relationship with our parents was, or watching our relationship with our parents. But is we can at least have any insight to say that could have affected me. I'm going to be open to the idea that that could have had some effect on who I am as a person. It didn't destroy me. It didn't scar me. I'm not continuing to like, recreate that pattern perhaps, but to have any acknowledgement, that's really all that we can ask. It doesn't have to start with the deep interpersonal work or the deep internal work.
Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you wanted to open up, but you were afraid that it wouldn't be taken well? You ask yourself, what's the point? Nothing's going to change anyway. So you do what you always do. You push it down, numb out the pain with a drink, a night out, or pornography. I've been there myself, and I know that men lack the outlets for emotional expression, which is why I founded Men's Therapy Online, a healing hub for men's mental health. If you've been knocked on your ass or just crave meaningful connection, join Men's Therapy Online, a community of men who just get it. We offer individual therapy, men's groups, and powerful retreats, all led by licensed therapists. At Men's Therapy Online, we will help you to get back on your feet and take your life to the next level. Start your journey today at menstherapy.online. Well, so I hear both of you really talking about the value of nuance, right? Which I think also leads to forgiveness. But I'm curious, like, how do you help someone move towards forgiveness or towards nuance, whether it be for their partner or towards themselves? Because I do think, our culture likes simple stories, right? And in divorce, there's always like, okay, who was the bad one? Right. And I think in Western culture, it's often the male identified person that's like the bad one's like, what did you do? Right. What did you do? Did you cheat? Did you hit her? Did you drink too much? Like, were you absent? Like, you're the bad one. I find a lot of guys come to me initially feeling like they're the villain in the story, where of course there's much more nuance and complexity, like you're all talking about. Or they're demonizing their ex, right? Their ex is the worst person on the planet, and they're this enemy in their lives, and they're sabotaging their life and their children's life and everybody's life, and they're lying about everything, and it's like this horrible, monster out there, right? That's is only committed to destroying the client. It's like very intense, it's very dramatic, but it's also very black and white and very simple. So I'm curious for the two of you, how can some move towards nuance and then perhaps eventually towards forgiveness?
Makes me think about is that somehow they have to have some motivation, right? Because it's really it's very seductive to be angry and to disavow all of your responsibility and all your bad feelings and put them into that bitch or whoever it is that you're angry at. It feels really good, and I think it's really hard to step out of that towards something that, I mean, I think what it makes me think about is that people are also feeling really bad and they're trying just really hard not to feel really bad, and the positing of the problem in the other person, and leaning on that and being enraged at them is an escape from feeling bad. It feels much better, truthfully. And I think if it can slowly, or maybe even not so slowly, like I'll just say to people sometimes, I'll try to highlight the ways in which I can see that they're suffering. Like, is this really making you feel better? And how is your relationship with your two children doing? How do they respond when you say this about their mother in front of them? Like I think people are inclined to seek an escape in digging into a stance like that, and I just kind of try to be a mirror for reality. Like if you really want to feel this way, there's nothing else can happen from this stance, and you'll have nothing else available to you in any kind of other relationship. You'll have nothing else available to you. You'll be limited in what you can get with your children or whoever else. I don't know if it's not really like a really tried and true recipe, because sometimes people are, I mean, I think the reality of it is that sometimes it has everything to do with how invested is somebody in maintaining that stance. Like, if somebody really is invested in, like, no, 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 fuck him or fuck her, like, I'm staying here because I need to. Well, okay, maybe they need to for a while, and there's not a lot that I can do to back them off of that. I can try to draw their attention and test things out a little bit, but in reality, I think it has to do with their interest in their capacity to feel something different.
It's hard to teach someone nuance as much as it is to recognize that nuance is not there. And a lot of that, not to keep coming back to this, but I do think it's harder for men who go through a relationship and need to kind of identify the ex-partner as the villain, because they feel like that's kind of the masculine thing to do. It is my job to have done nothing wrong and to have survived, this terrible person. And now I've conquered this and moved on. And if we try to shake that at all, then it becomes, oh, then I failed, or this is my fault, and then the pendulum swings completely the other way. So we can't, that there isn't room for nuance within that. But to your point of just kind of constantly reflecting, this sounds like a lot of energy being spent, on this one person when you might have kids, or how's work going? How's the new relationship? How is dating in general? Like, there's so many other things that for this to take up so much energy in your life, simply just pointing that out at least lets them acknowledge or respond to, it feels important for me to have all of this hate or all of this vitriol, because that's what's motivating me, or that's what's keeping me going. Like, even that, acknowledging that would be a step in the direction of nuance, even if it isn't necessarily changing.
I think I said to somebody once, like, when they were kind of off on a tangent about their ex, like, I was getting kind of bored and frustrated with it. And I just sort of said, like, if I didn't know any better, I think you were still in love with her. And, by the way, amount you talk about her, and he got enraged at me, and thankfully came back, and I think it was actually somewhat of a reality check. But, yeah, I don't know if there's no science to it, I don't think.
Yeah. One way I frame it with some of the guys I work with is like, if you don't accept some version of responsibility, you're not going to be able to change or control anything. If you're just entirely a victim, then how are you going to make it better the next time? And for those listening, if you're in this stance of like demonizing the ex, I'd encourage you to listen to some of our stuff on the nice guy syndrome. We interviewed Dr. Robert Glover on the show. We have a ton of blogs on it. And the idea is like, okay, if you feel like you got stepped on and this person was like a terror in your life, you also let that happen, right? Like you didn't set up boundaries. You didn't have the emotional skills or conflict resolution ability to be able to set those things early in the relationship. And that's something that you can learn if only to make sure it doesn't happen again, and hopefully that's enough motivation to want to take a look and maybe autopsy parts of their relationship and figure out what happened here. Um, I think you both mentioned it, but this is a whole nother podcast topic. But how about kids, right? I mean, like there's also people that are often involved in divorce that are not um, the ones that are breaking up. So I'm curious what your thoughts are around, how do you tell the kids? How do you co-parent? Any words of wisdom for our listeners? Because that is a huge, huge part of this whole story.
I mean, there's lots of things I'd love to say. I mean, the reality I've experienced with people is I'm going to be, banging the same drum here, that what I say has very little consequence if they're, if they're unable to or unwilling to sort of look at what actually happened and take responsibility for it, and like, if they're just so invested in, demonizing their ex and having that sort of, tunnel vision about what happened and where they're going, and then it makes it challenging to say anything that supports their relationship with their kids, or for them to take a stance that's supportive of their kids. And it's tragic and it's really painful to watch. But this is why I think I mean, I'm, really banging the drum for, like, be courageous and look at yourself, be courageous and look at your relationship, take the opportunity to, change things that have probably needed to change for a really long time. So you can have a better relationship maybe in the future, but also you can have like a meaningful relationship with your children. And if you don't do that, you kind of can't, or you could, but it'll be hamstrung. The less you're able to actually take accountability and, accurately what happened. I mean, that's what kids need. That was their experience, and that's what they need to hear. They need someone, the adults around them, taking accountability for what happened. And if the adults are not doing that, it's really troubling to watch.
And I think my go-to is always your kids will never thank you for trying to vilify another parent. They'll never appreciate trying to be turned against. That's never a tactic that's going to be effective. And I think, again, this gets back to when it feels like no one's in your corner. Your children are going to be the easiest people for you to think that that's who you should try to have on your team. It inevitably degrades into the relationship with my children is now about getting them on my side and vilifying this other person. And it creates so many divides in what the relationship is. And I've just seen that so many countless times now in different ways that it becomes heartbreaking to see. But as far as to just speak to my own experience as a child of divorce, which isn't a novel thing, but as much as the fact that I went through that and then went through so much training as a therapist, which requires so much internal work and delving into so many things that could have affected us, could have impacted us. It was always something that I look back on now and really appreciate how much, it wasn't necessarily like, oh, it's fine, we're getting a divorce and it's lovely. Like, don't sugarcoat it by any means, but it was pragmatic and it made sense. And, it's you have to learn kind of, I think, through talking with other people or going to therapy and like how to speak to children and developmentally what makes sense. But I just remember in college, a friend coming to me and breaking down and crying because her parents were going through a divorce, and me being so surprised at that reaction, because in my mind I was thinking, oh, this is probably good for them. This is probably going to make the relationship of the family as a whole more successful if they're that unhappy, in the relationship. And she was just like, my life is completely over. Everything's going to change. So that really shook me in the sense of depending on the messaging that you're getting from your parents, it's going to drastically impact how you perceive what's going on. So anything that you say to your kids, it's being taken verbatim, and viscerally, it's going into everything that they're thinking about what's going on as well, either real or imagined.
Yeah. I mean, I think, like I said, there's a ton of stuff there, and that'll probably be our next divorce roundtable, focused exclusively on co-parenting and how to navigate that minefield. But I really appreciated what you both have had to say about that, right? Because I think, it's the hardest part to navigate. I think it's also what prevents people that, perhaps should get a divorce from getting a divorce. And then you have kids that are being raised in a very tense and maybe even aggressive household. But as we're wrapping up here, I'm curious from each of you, what is one thing our listeners can do, think about, ponder? If there's somebody who is newly divorced, right? They're kind of in that ashes, rock bottom place. What is something that you recommend that they take away from this episode?
This might be kind of cliche in some ways, but I don't know if it's really a question that people going through a divorce or having had gone through divorce think about, of just like, well, what does divorce actually mean to you? What's the messaging that you've received around it? Because if you've just been told your whole life that divorce is a failure, you're going to have a much harder time believing anything that we have said, or at large, anyone that's trying to provide an alternative explanation, to really even just contextually think about, what does that mean to me to have gone through something like that, and to try to see emotionally how that hits you. Because if it truly still feels like a boulder or such a heavy weight, I would really try to examine that, because there's probably where you'll find certainly some pain and some hurt, but that might be the key to trying to move forward or find hope or find a different way to sit with the idea of divorce without it being destructive.
Yeah, I think I'm trying not to sound like trite and make lemonade out of lemons or say something silly like that, but it's not really. I mean, it's kind of what I'm thinking about is sort of in that same vein. I'll try to be a little bit more eloquent about it though, where I just think the reality is you go through, you move through life and you're just doing the best you can with what you've got. And then sometimes shit doesn't work out. And you can either just keep moving and not take it as an opportunity, not really if you were starting a business or you had a career, or, if it didn't work and you didn't do anything to acknowledge what happened and why, and you just kind of kept going, or didn't know how to keep going. That's really the only way I think you can move forward from a position like that, is just take stock of what happened and what does it mean. And maybe you never liked women to begin with, and that's why your relationship didn't work out, and you should probably be dating people of another gender. And or maybe you just don't not maybe you just didn't want kids, and that was not really something you got signed up for it, you didn't want to. I mean, there's any number of things that could have gone wrong, and I think just take it as an opportunity to reckon with who you really are, and what you really need to do if you want it to move forward. What happened? Just look at it really plainly, no judgment. What happened here, and what does it mean? What can I learn? What can I learn about myself from it?
And maybe, again, I don't know if we've highlighted this a lot, but maybe it was a great relief. It was one of the best things that ever happened to you. Maybe it was wonderful. You're out of something abusive or horrible, or you did what you needed to do to protect your children, or, any other reason that divorce can happen as well. So, you know, to be able to sit in that without thinking, oh, I should feel bad in some way about this, and to make I feel like I did this last time, Ben, too, but to make a shout out for group therapy in kind of this context of, like, if your feeling of divorce is that it is a failure and that it feels impenetrable, then what a great place to go and just say, like, okay, well, here's a group of other like-minded men who have also gone through divorce. Can I at least listen to their perspective and see what that might be?
Yeah, I mean, just to feedback off that, right? Like we offer divorce dad specific groups at Men's Therapy Online. Also listen to podcasts like this. There's tons of divorce podcasts. The Dad Edge by Larry Hagner is really, really good. I like that show a lot. But like, yeah, hearing other guys, other people's perspectives that are further along the path from you, whether that be a professional paid service or just finding other divorced people in your life, is so critical. Because what I see with so many men, and again, I think it's our culture more than our gender, is like we just isolate, right? We go in the man cave and then we're on an echo chamber. And then all of a sudden we're on Reddit of people just like complaining about their exes and we're just getting fed toxicity and pain and hatred. And, we can get extreme, become extreme views. And it gets crazy for guys out there. It gets real crazy for guys. So like, if you can just find some kind of grounding and I know the impulse is to retreat and to hide, and if all you can do is listen to a podcast like this, great. But at least there's some kind of crack of light coming into that dark place that you may be in. So if you stuck with us this long, I really appreciate you tuning in because hopefully we can be, maybe a voice of reason or a couple of experts that have, walked this path with many, many guys before and show that there is hope. There is a way to recover from this and that your life is not over. It's changed, like irrevocably has changed, but it's not over. So as we're wrapping up, you guys share a little bit about where people can find you online if they want to hear more about you or follow more of your thoughts. So, Jack, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'm Jack Knows Best on Instagram. You can find my information with the blog posts on Men Therapy Online. I'm also writing something for December on coming out late in life and related to that. So feel free to check that out, and hopefully we'll be on another podcast soon.
Absolutely.
And you can find me on the good old interwebs, benjaminwhite.us. For now, that's where I reside, and I also have a blog post that I will have coming out on midlife issues, midlife crisis, I think it's called, but I'm using crisis in quotes because I'm trying to make it not into a crisis. And look forward to being on more podcasts.
Awesome. Well, love having you two on the show. You'll definitely be back for sure. Listeners, keep tuning in. If you like these guys, they're not going anywhere. So all of our stuff, as you know, is at menstherapy.online. That's the hub. We have blogs and podcast episodes, a few featuring these guys at this point. So you can go back in our archive. You can search and find the episodes that they're on. We also have more blogs you're never going to be able to read. We have a free online Slack community. So if you're a guy that's looking for some support, if you're divorced and money is an issue, which, it is, maybe it's a whole other round table is divorce finances. But if money is an issue, we have a free, 100% free, no charge, no commitment Slack community. We have about 200 guys on there already that are talking about issues just like this. And you can get on and get some mental health support without paying us a dime. And if you do want to work with us, we do offer individual, couples, and group therapy for guys like yourself going through it. So all that is at menstherapy.online. So guests, thanks again for joining us. And listeners, thank you again for tuning in. We will see you next week, another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to visit menstherapy.online to learn more about the work that we are doing to support and inspire men. Until next time, keep moving forward.